The Belit Star may have just given us one of the biggest pieces of information we've had about the Heavenly Principles, the Voyager, and the Abyss. And it wasn't even through the main World Quest series. No, what I'm talking about is a couple of texts that were hidden around Pale Crown Palace titled as Notes by a Certain Noble Individual. And in those texts, there were a couple of pieces of lore that caught my personal attention and made me think about a topic that had actually been discussed a little bit a couple of months ago. The Heavenly Principles may actually be indirectly helping the Abyss. And before you start calling me insane or saying that we already knew about this, I'm not saying that Phanes is secretly working with the Abyss and wants it to win, or even that we didn't actually know about this very topic at all. Quite literally the opposite, in fact. Because the way that Celestia has dealt with Teyvat so far, and its civilizations, as well as the concept of the fate system, may have actually created a problem that is now becoming impossible to contain. Furthermore, we also know that fate has an influence on the Abyss, something we actually learned back in Luna 5 or version 6.4 through Alice and of course Barbalot by extension. She's the one who came up with the concept, and I feel like what we have gotten through these series of texts is effectively validation and second confirmation on what is happening. Yet I believe there are things in this note, in these series of notes, that are significantly important to clear up and to discuss as well, along with some minor theories as well. The Belyi Tsar, lost and confused after awakening from the pits of the Cryo Sovereign's decaying body, ended up learning and focusing on his role as primordial human, looking into and researching his ancestors and the role that they deigned him to follow. He then went into the ruins of Hyperborea, pursuing and hunting for an answer that will give him and all the Fae a direction. However, what he found was something far more surprising when he entered the passage to the Shadow Realm and Hyperborea. In subsequent records and searches was that there was someone the Hyperboreans titled the Saint, and that their true name was Anacarsus, and they who rebelled against the Heavenly Principles and courted what was eventual destruction. Hey, just a quick one. If you guys enjoyed this video and you want to see more Genshin theories, lore breakdowns, and discussions, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, as it'll be massively appreciated and I will thank you guys very much so. Comment down below as well, what are your thoughts about this topic and where do you guys lie in regards to the Abyss, the Heavenly Principles, and Anacarsus? On with the video now. Let's talk about it straight away. You might have already been able to guess who Anacarsus is, but if you haven't already, they are the ones the Hyperboreans used to call Sutervoinen, the lover of Koitar and the one we call the Voyager. The Belyi Tsar, amongst his various forays into the Shadow Realm, discovered various details about Anacarsus and what they were doing on Teyvat. Looking for the light from the very genesis of the world, aka Nibelung, they spent time ascertaining whether or not once Nibelung was defeated by the Heavenly Principles, if the light was truly extinguished. They then, of course, led the rebellion to challenge the Heavenly Principles that was inevitably destined to fail. However, what was a major surprise to the Belyi Tsar and to us, the readers, was that Hyperborea was actually always destined to fail, even before Anacarsus had come to Teyvat and intervened. Not even Koitar herself solely would have been able to decry the destiny that was arriving for Hyperborea, and all they could do was provide a mere delay of about 30 years. At this point, the Belyi Tsar even mentions that all his previous notions about Anacarsus leading the people of Hyperborea to destruction was hasty, and it can be disproven, as what they ended up getting at the end was actually far more generous than the end they were due to get. Along with this, there was a further reveal of something far more important, one that led me to actually create this video and this discussion. Anacarsus created the Shadow Realm as a failsafe against the Abyss, a realm that was beyond the hands of Celestia, where their power could not sustain itself, for there was no wind, no time passing, nor any elemental energy. What Anacarsus had created was basically a antithesis to the Void Realm and the human realm. It was basically a film that separated the Abyss from the Beyond and it breaching Teyvat. However, due to the Belyi Tsar opening up the passage, in his own words foolishly, he had effectively led to the Abyss being able to seep through into Teyvat without any pause. Now, just bear in mind, what I'm saying here isn't that the Belyi Tsar introduced Teyvat to the Abyss, right? But he effectively allowed it to seep in again. Because remember, Nibelung is the first individual to bring the Abyss to Teyvat. I'm just reminding you guys that because I know some people will think that this means that the Belyi Tsar brought the Abyss into Teyvat, whereas that's not the case. He effectively brought it back into Teyvat. You could say that, yes, but the first individual is still Nibelung to bring the Abyss into Teyvat. Okay, just keep that in mind. However, due to the nature of the Shadow Realm, the seepage was only at the time a slow process and it was still manageable. In a weird sense of fate, Anacarsus, in his endeavor to keep the world that he saw the light of and was hoping was not extinguished, safe and secure from the darkness that lay beyond the skies of Teyvat, he unfortunately also led to the Hyperboreans being, you could say, very aggressive in their research, more risk-taking, you could say, because the creation of the Hyperboreans, the primordial human they created, one that was actually supposed to replicate said light, was the one who actually ended up causing the seepage of the Abyss into Teyvat again. Ironic, isn't it? Furthermore, talking about fate, in notes by a certain noble individual number 4, the Belit Star had actually further investigated and learned more about the world through his continuous forays into the Shadow Realm and came to a conclusion that we had actually already heard from Alice and by extension Barbeloth a few months ago in Luna version 5. Hermione, I keep messing up the pronunciation of that word, is a word we actually heard during the events of the Narcissan Cruz Ordo and was effectively defined to be the representation of the fixed destiny and fate system that Celestia had imposed to discard alternative futures. This was actually also identified by the Belyi Tsar as well, and he discussed how Nibelung, who was the first non-refracted light basically, he cast an array of possibilities, but in order to achieve certainty and stability, the heavenly principles and man, as the Belyi Tsar had written in the text, narrowed those bands of light to confine those possibilities and lose the shadow that first cast that pure light. And this is where things get interesting, because time moves in a loop, and with every loop that Teyvat circles, more and more fates get discarded, and more light bands are left to achieve unaccomplished endings, leading to further enhancing and strengthening the Abyss. The Belyi Tsar, following this, then made the decision to take up the role of the Cryo Archon to take the remains of the innocent to atone for his sin and decision in opening the Shadow Realm and causing a gash to let the Abyss seep through into Teyvat. However, centuries later, as Rotwang entered the Belit Tsar's court, it was confirmed that it was only a matter of time before the seepage of the Abyss, with how quickly it was growing, was going to inflict havoc on those contained within the shell that is the false sky. And this is where the Belit Tsar's story becomes much more important than simply being another tragic story about Hyperborea, because what he discovered doesn't just tell us about what happened to Anacarsus, it also tells us a more important story about the heavenly principles as well. For many years, we believed that all they did, the destruction of various civilizations, the upheaval of the world, was due to their paranoia and fear of the Abyss potentially even looking towards Teyvat wrongly. But what if the heavenly principles' attempt to control Teyvat is actually making the Abyss stronger? For me, this was, I would say it was a little bit of a revelation and something to think about further. Because while I think we all assumed that this was the case when Alice had actually mentioned the Abyss and the concept and theory that Barbeloth had come up with regarding the fate system affecting the Abyss, it being revalidated by the Belit Tsar has basically given us more of a confirmation that this is indeed the case, and that the heavenly principles may be, I would say not even maybe at this point, is definitely a lot more fallible than what we had anticipated. Once again, the Tsaritsa and Pierrot, you could say, are indeed correct, right? The gods have their limits. Because frankly speaking, I do think it once again comes back to the heavenly principles not having that extra cognition and decision-making capability, and frankly speaking, it bolsters a theory I discussed in a previous video of the heavenly principles segmenting its emotional rationale module or cognitive capability and only focusing on reason and logic. And while that can provide some good decision-making abilities, I believe that the decisions made regarding the Hyperboreans and even some others were unnecessarily out of control and arguably led the people of Teyvat on its own crash course to have to deal with the Abyss. Had the HP and Celestia reigned in and not caused the absolute devastation of Hyperborea, arguably the Belit Tsar wouldn't have been in the position to make the decision to open up their Shadow Realm to discover and learn about his past and his creators, because his creators or at least some of his creators, would be still alive, avoiding the seepage of the Abyss through the Shadow Realm. At the end of the day, the Belit Star was just a lost soul, unknowing of what he was actually made for, and that was the decision he made to learn about himself. Similarly, if we talk about the decision taken for Khaenri'ah and the destruction of the nation, had it been more localized and focused in on destroying the monsters and punishing those primarily involved in the creation of it, Reindaughter, and obviously King Ermin by extension, because he was looking to harness the power of the Abyss, rather than the whole nation being punished, arguably you would not have a Abyss Order right now seeking revenge and allying themselves with the Abyss and providing a potential in, right? If every possible future exists as a possibility and Celestia's system continuously removes those possibilities in order to create one fixed outcome, then what happens to everything that was discarded? And like as we've discussed multiple times so far, it becomes a part of the Abyss. The Heavenly Principles has made decisions that are steeped in paranoia and the sole goal of protecting Teyvat by any means necessary. And yet I would say that this decision has been quite an aggressive one in nature, and one that most assuredly is helping power up the Abyss that is circling and preying on Teyvat. By introducing the fate system and cutting off more fates and loss of possibilities, you could argue that they have needlessly allowed the Abyss to not only power itself incredibly so, but also make it obsessed with Teyvat due to the never-ending loop cycle of fates being discarded. Additionally, decisions that have led their own civilization to not only continuously rebel, but for them to look at alternatives and branch realms to access and bring the Abyss and forbidden knowledge to Teyvat has been a recurring thing in Teyvat, with multiple individuals across multiple generations looking into it. And this is the cycle that I think we've been seeing throughout Teyvat. Phanes trying to suppress a civilization. That civilization searches for another solution. That solution eventually leads them towards the Abyss or forbidden knowledge. The Abyss becomes stronger, Celestia sees the Abyss become stronger and responds even more aggressively. And then the cycle repeats itself again and again and again. The Heavenly Principles is trying to put out the fire, but some of the methods they are using may actually be throwing fuel onto it. In the case of Anacarsus or the Voyager, to be honest, I want to talk about them a little bit because I don't think they had anything but good intentions from the very beginning. Warning Nibelung to coming back for Nibelung and then staying to protect and aid Teyvat in the best way possible, challenging the Heavenly Principles to help the civilizations, and most importantly, creating the Shadow Realm, which became a blockade against the Abyss for the foreseeable future. However, you could argue and say that Anacarsus, in his endeavor to protect the light, also led the light to the darkness, right? Because she, I should say, because her consciousness is a she just took a body of a boy when she came to Teyvat later on, right? She ended up warning Nibelung about the Abyss, and obviously he then went out into the Sea of Stars to learn more, to try and find solutions against the Abyss, but ended up bringing the Abyss back to Teyvat. What if that wasn't the case at all? What if Nibelung was there and present when the Heavenly Principles came to Teyvat? Would things have been different? Most likely, right? Assuredly so. So you could say that if there's any mistake from Anacarsus in this equation to helping the Abyss, you could say it was just warning Nibelung in the first place. That was arguably a mistake, you could say, right? But we don't know how things would have ended. Would Nibelung have still gone out into space after the Heavenly Principles would have come to just try and figure out something? Maybe. We don't know, right? We just don't know in this situation as to what would have happened. But I will also say this, not to be a Heavenly Principles glazer or anything, I still believe they are fairly in the wrong in terms of what they're doing, right? Yes, you are a ruler. Yes, you're trying to protect the world, but the methods you're using aren't necessarily the most civil. But at the same time, you have to remember that Phanes is the help that Phanes is giving the Abyss, you could say, if you want to call it help, isn't really direct, right? It's just indirectly. Phanes is still a being that very much hates the Abyss with every bit of their soul, and we have seen them indiscriminately targeting those who are even the slightest bit affiliated with the Abyss within its domain, or at least when they were still awake. Currently, we do not see that happening. Otherwise, of course, the events of Nadlan, oh my god, what we saw in Natlan, we would have been dead. Everybody in that vicinity would have been dead. It would have been way more devastating, and the Abyss Order at this point would probably not exist as well, to be honest, right? They are very strict, and they enforce these rigid rules, and they obviously complete the False Sky using the Lunar Veil technology to hide Teyvat. They have ensured the survival of humanity, and we've seen so many characters in game as well, right? Mahavika, I think, is the one that I remember the most, affirming this very topic about the heavenly principles. Yes, they are very strict, but what they have done is still, you could argue and say, for the protection of humanity from the Abyss, right? While these are cruel decisions and very suppressive, at the core of it all, the idea is to halt the Abyss in its attempt to infiltrate Teyvat. So ultimately, I don't think the heavenly principles is helping the Abyss because they wanted to win. If anything, I think the opposite is true. The problem is really that the methods they've used to protect Teyvat may have actually created the exact conditions that allowed the Abyss to continue growing and to continue it to be obsessed with Teyvat. The more faiths that are discarded, the more the Abyss strengthens, the more civilization Celestia destroys, the more people, the more humanity is pushed towards rebelling against them. And the more people rebel against Celestia, the more likely they are to seek power from the Abyss. It's a vicious cycle. And if the Abyss is really being set up as the final threat of the Teyvat chapter, which I believe it's the case, then I don't think we're just going to have to defeat the Abyss. We're gonna actually have to deal with the system that allowed it to become this powerful in the first place. And we've seen that already. We've seen it with the Ermin's Soul, right? That has been thrown into the gutter, basically, right? It's been burnt up. Something has replaced it already, but there's gonna be a full revamp coming, 100%. And I think that is where things are going to get really, really interesting.